Yeah, now it is. Okay, great. Okay, I think we will get started. Before we turn to our panel, I am delighted to introduce Danielle Conway. Danielle Conway is the president-elect of the AALS. She is the Dean and Donald J. Farage Professor of Law and the Executive Director of the Anti-Racist Development Institute at Penn State Dickinson Law School. She was previously the Dean at the University of Maine Law School, where she went after 14 years on the faculty of the University of Hawaii at Manoa Law School, where she was the inaugural Michael J. Marks Distinguished Professor of Business Law. To my mind, as someone who has a house in Hawaii to avoid the relatively mild DC winters, this move from Hawaii to Maine shows an almost heroic commitment to law school leadership. Dean Conway was previously on the faculties of Georgetown and Memphis law schools and La Trobe University in Australia. She's a leading expert in procurement law, entrepreneurship, and intellectual property. She is the co-recipient of the inaugural AALS Impact Award for her work in establishing the Law Dean's Anti-Racist Clearinghouse Project. She also holds many other sort of impressive titles that it would be more tedious than difficult to enumerate. She's also a fabulous public speaker, as I can say after hearing her deliver brief remarks last night. We greatly appreciate her taking the time from a packed annual meeting schedule to come over this afternoon to join us. Dean Conway.
Let me set it up here, but as I'm setting up, I want to recognize Lee Otis as the titan that she is. And she is more than kind, because others have said that I must be one of the dumbest people walking to move from Hawaii to Maine. So when we talk about kind, we know that Lee is probably the kindest of them all. Now, Lee, I did not know that you had a home in Hawaii. So after our conference, we need to get together and plan our calendar. So I go back every other year because my son was born in Hawaii, and that really makes me want to stay around for the birthright citizenship part of the workshop. Because I got to see what I got to work with. But we go back every other year because he is part of a baby hui. And so we have that connection. So Lee, I expect not only the invitation, but I expect that we should meet for poo-poos, right? Okay. Well, enough of that. Welcome and thank you for inviting me to the 27th annual conference to feature faculty in their works in progress, but also in their learned productions. On behalf of the AALS Executive Committee, I want to thank you for partnering with us as an organization to bring many more opportunities for investigation, discovery, and discourse. I like to think about this partnership as an engagement in a joint meeting to bring truth, facts, and data to the fore. Particularly, I want to thank the Federalist Society for three things. I'm such a good law professor. First, I want to thank you for the sustained commitment to academic freedom. I'll be talking about this in my Friday. If you can stand it, come to the House of Representatives at 12:45 to hear about my thoughts on academic freedom. The theme is called Emancipate Academic Freedom. And there's none other than the Federalist Society who has fought the fight for academic freedom. So I look forward to seeing how we can work together on this important and challenging issue. There are two really important issues that I want to thank you for. First, those two issues involve our law schools. I want to thank you for being meaningful contributors to our students' education, giving them meaningful opportunities to disagree, to find similarity in opinion. And I'm going to be really straightforward here. You know, our schools and our students in particular face things like food insecurity. Federalist Society is always there to help our students eat. You know I'm speaking the truth, right? But it's real. It is real. But more important, and more to the point, the thing I really want to applaud you for is being there for our faculty, particularly our new faculty, who depend on your reading and analyzing their scholarship and making sure that they are shepherded through the promotion and tenure process. I have called on so many Federalist Society members to help me as a dean shepherd our faculty to tenure. That's one law school. There are 200 law schools, and we depend on you. So please stay active in that engagement because all of our faculty need you. Finally, in conclusion, you are partners in the production of knowledge work and the efforts of knowledge creators, knowledge workers. Let us join hands to make sure that in this production of knowledge work and in support of knowledge workers, we keep academic freedom at the forefront. Congratulations on a strong and comprehensive program. I can't wait for this year because we've got work to do together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, yeah. I do those. Okay. Even better. Thank you so much, President-elect Conway. And I gather you become President Conway tomorrow. Am I correct about that? Yes. I'll very much look forward to your term as AALS president. At this time, I would like to call up our abundance panel, who are going to tell us abundant things. It will be moderated. Everything seems to be moderated by a friend of mine at the moment. I don't know how that happened, but it will be moderated by my very good friend, Christina Mulligan from Brooklyn Law School.
All right. So welcome to Abundance in the Law. And here we have four excellent panelists: Chris Walker from the University of Michigan, Danielle Lyons from Boston College, Bridget Dooling from The Ohio State University, that's how you're supposed to say it, and Dan Walker.
Go Bucks. Shoot. Did I say that out loud on video?
Chris Walker, formerly from The Ohio State University, and Dan Walters from Texas A&M. Our thoughts are also with someone who would have been one of our panelists, Jonathan Adler, who couldn't be here due to a family emergency. We're going to do this panel in the structure of opening remarks and then Q&A, some Q by me, some Q by you, so feel free to go up to the podium as our final speaker is finishing up to get ready. I want to situate this panel discussion of the abundance agenda in the law just before we get started. You're probably all here because you know what we're talking about, but in case you don't, the guiding star of the idea of abundance is that the private sector and the public sector should focus on growing the pie, increasing the supply of good things, rather than dividing it up in more equitable and equal ways. It was really kicked off this year by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book Abundance, and also Mark Dunkelman's book Why Nothing Works. Klein and Thompson rely a lot on Nicholas Badgley's law article, The Procedure Fetish, to argue that ideas like caring about fairness, risk aversion, not wanting to get things wrong, and valuing democratic engagement lead to there being too many veto points and overburdensome regulations to get any public or private project done. Klein and Thompson particularly aimed their book at the political left of center because that's where they have credibility, but we all know that the people on the right of the center have long critiqued overregulation, and that raises the tantalizing possibility that the abundance agenda could create some points of productive collaboration between people with politics on both sides of the aisle. Of course, one critique of abundance is that it's just too abstract an idea. While some critics on the left are kind of wary of abundance as an excuse for, bad capitalism, most people vaguely are just like, more stuff sounds good. More stuff is good, overregulating is bad, who's opposed to this? So the devil's really in the details about whether this idea has meaning and can really lead to anything good. And that leads us to this panel, because who better than lawyers to grapple with the specifics of what needs to change and what doesn't. So with that, I'm gonna hand the microphone over to Chris Walker, and we're gonna move to my left, to your right as we go. So Chris, take it away.
Great, awesome. Well, this is going to be super fun. I wanted to zoom out and kind of situate the abundance movement within kind of larger trends in law and governance. And I don't know how many of you follow administrative law and regulatory practice, but in the last few years, there's been some changes. We've had a huge, what Jaylen Metzger called an anti-administrativist turn at the U.S. Supreme Court. Through non-delegation, major questions, getting rid of Chevron deference, and now the unitary executive stuff that we're seeing this term. But we've also then, of course, seen the Trump 2 administration, or 2.0, take it to a whole different level. And so you have this kind of moment right now where both the Supreme Court and the Trump administration have disrupted the establishment in administrative law and the administrative state. And when I say establishment, I think it's kind of a largely pragmatic procedural foundation that administrative law has, with values like fairness, predictability, reliability. Those are kind of what we usually thought for the last 5 decades. The Scalia version of administrative law really focused on those values. And I have to say, though, when you do have a major disruption like that, it creates opportunities for new theories and for rebuilding in ways that are different than what we had before. And I want to kind of flag at least 4 different paths. One is the anti-administrative path. We can continue on that path, and what we would see is that almost all of the administrative state is unconstitutional, and whatever is left is highly constrained by the president, by courts, and Congress. So I think that's kind of where we go if we keep on going on that direction. That would involve reinvigorating the non-delegation doctrine, among other things. The other thing we could do is we could try to preserve the New Deal, modern administrative state. And maybe that's a leftist center approach, or maybe it's a far left of center approach. And the far left of center approach would be to say that the modern administrative state is now constitutionally required, or that the administrative state is more democratically accountable than Congress. And you kind of see those 2 moves going on in what I would call more the far left. The far, far left is whatever collectivism is these days, and the law and political economy movement. Actually have government take over industry and somehow run it better than the markets would. And then you have kind of the center-left abundance movement that has a ton of appeal to the center, I think both center-left and center-right. And the reason why, at least I think it's appealing, are kind of 2 values that it pushes. One is effective government. If we're going to have a government at all with a Congress or legislature that passes laws, maybe those laws should actually work. Maybe we should actually have a government that does what the people vote for the government to do. And so I think the Abundance Movement, part of its message is we want effective government. And the second one is one Christina already kind of flagged, which is we want more opportunities for a good life. We want cheaper products. We want more affordable homes. We want better jobs. We want better technology. We want inventions. We want progress. And to get there, the Abundance Movement, as we'll talk about throughout the whole panel, has a certain path forward. Now, Christina mentioned, I think the leading architect on the legal side of the abundance is my colleague, Nick Bagley. And back in 2017, Nick wrote an article, Nick wrote a blog post in the Yale Journal of Regulation. It was dealing with the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. And it was being challenged by Texas and Northern Court. And it was being challenged because it didn't go through notice of comment rulemaking. And Nick writes this post and says, hey, it didn't need to. It doesn't matter. They got notice. President Obama held a press conference. And everyone complained. They got a comment. Lots of complaints. Go watch Fox News. So you don't have to go through what the APA calls notice of comment rulemaking if you want to do this because it's harmless, a harmless error, right? And so then he writes this long article in the Columbia Law Review called Remedial Restraint in Administrative Law, where he advances this argument, to be fair, in a more nuanced way than his blog post, but basically saying we shouldn't care about procedure as much, and courts shouldn't review things as much as they do. I was asked to write a response, and my response just added against to the front of it, against remedial restraint in administrative law. And I took a very foremost approach, approaching administrative law from a bright line rule administrability perspective, and also from a very different viewpoint of distrusting bureaucracy as opposed to trusting it. Nick then, of course, took this a step further in his work with the next paper, which I told him, please don't name it this. Like, call it over-proceduralism, but no, we're calling it the procedure fetish, which I don't even want to say that word out loud. Which then he goes beyond, like, courts just shouldn't be deferential to agencies when they do stuff. Agencies should also not have to use procedures as much. We've over-proceduralized administrative law. Last term, in a case called Wages and Lyons, FDA versus Wages and Lyons, I think Nick won our debate from 2017, or at least somewhat. There, Justice Alito, writing for the court, said, maybe we're being a little too searching our judicial review. Maybe we should hold more errors harmless and not require agencies to do it again. Let them pass through as long as we think it's harmless. And he won, I think, to a certain degree. He's won our debate a little bit. I will say he's also won me over more than I would have confessed, I would ever imagine years ago. And so I kind of want to end with that, is that what's missing in the abundance movement is any role of proportionality. In other words, if I'm advancing a new vision for the administrative state, I would say we should center the administrative state on proportionality. And what I mean by that, it's pretty simple. The more impactful, the more important the regulatory action, the more we expect from Congress to direct that regulatory action, the more we expect from agencies to engage in procedure and provide reasons, and the more exacting judicial review we expect from courts. So on the one end, really, it's hard for agencies to do the really major stuff. We want them to be careful. We want Congress to be involved. We want courts to patrol it. And this you actually already see in the Supreme Court precedent. The major questions doctrine, I think, is a classic example of a ratchet on one side of saying, we're going to presume agencies don't have the power to do this stuff unless Congress acts more clearly. But the converse is also true. When agencies are implementing statutes, when they're filling up the details, where their expertise matters the most because it's not as much about value judgments and about technical implementation, there's still obviously value judgment, but it's more on that end. I argue that courts should play a very limited role, that Congress can delegate freely, and that agencies can decide how much procedure they want to have. Maybe no procedure at all for certain stuff. And so if you have that kind of view, it changes how you think about administrative law. Of course, the in-between's the hardest part, and that's kind of what I'm exploring in a new paper of between the most major questions that Congress can't delegate or has to delegate very carefully and the stuff that they can delegate freely. And there you have to also have a proportional approach. The more important the question, the more you'd expect from agencies, from Congress, and from courts. And so what I view as the problem with the abundance movement, or at least one of them, and maybe it's a friendly amendment, although I doubt it is that there should be a more proportional approach. That if we're just granting permits that Congress has already fleshed out the details, then agencies should have a lot of flexibility. But if we're making the major value judgments, that shouldn't be left to an agency. That should be left to an elected body like a legislature. And that's going to slow down the abundance movement, but it's going to mean that we the people, are still the ones that are ultimately deciding how quickly we move to make progress in the world. So that's kind of where I'm at on the Q&A. I'm kind of excited to kind of go back and forth.
Daniel?
Thanks. So I'll admit I was a little bit late to the abundance discussion. I have a colleague at BC who also happens to be my neighbor across the street. So I watch her kids grow up. She watched my kids grow up. I think it's fair to say we're friends, but disagree on just about everything. It's like the line from Shakespeare, like we strive mightily, but eat and drink as friends, right? And I remember her coming up to me in the fall with this book and being like, Daniel, I found something we might be able to agree on. And I think she's right. I think from a center-right perspective, I think there is a lot to like about where abundance takes off, right? And I think it should be applauded. On the one, the first I think is it's a refreshingly optimistic take, right? Klein and Thompson have a faith in growth and innovation as the key drivers to solve America's problems, and I think this is an explicit break from sort of the dominant strands of political conversation on the progressive left, at least, which largely assumes that the pie is fixed and all the big policy questions are how do we divide that pie. Sort of like Matt Iglesias' book, A Billion Americans, a few years ago, argue that our policy should focus on how do we grow the pie and how do we reduce the barriers to growth and to innovation. And I think it also is really good at diagnosing the role of the government as an inhibitor of that growth and innovation, right? I think that's also spot on. As I was reading the book, what came to mind was the Bruce Willis meme from Die Hard, like, welcome to the party, pal. Regulatory accumulation creates costs, and those costs are going to limit the degrees of freedom that actors can engage in as they're trying to address the big problems of the day. And then proceduralism has, I think they're right, become a tool for activists to turn process into veto gates to prevent projects from getting done that they personally disagree with. The book's first case study, I think, is particularly solid, showing how zoning law and environmental review procedures have worked together to limit our housing supply, and that drives up costs, and it's exacerbated the urban homelessness problem. In the tech policy space where I work, we see similar dynamics at play with regard to the BEAD program. This is an appropriation during the pandemic where Congress set aside $42.5 billion for the NTIA to roll out broadband around the country. But the NTIA couldn't help itself, right? So as it began designing the grant programs, it attached a whole bunch of conditions to the money that were completely unrelated to the goal of getting broadband to people who don't have it, right? You have to use union labor. You have to make sure, or a strong preference for fiber optic cable over other types of communication. Any company that's building out has to agree to rate regulation for low-income consumers. Abundance talks about this tendency, right? It's a tendency, particularly in liberal projects, Klein says, to require every project to address every interest groups simultaneously. It's sort of a long-standing critique, right, of the role that the groups play in shaping democratic discourse. Although I think it's important to note that the same problems exist on the Republican side as well. In abundance terms, what this means is these additional unrelated restrictions are going to increase building costs, they're going to reduce the number of competitors who can bid for projects, and they delay construction. And that's before we even start talking about the permitting rules at the local level that are also required in order for the digging to begin happening. When President Trump came into office, his NTIA secretary eliminated a lot of these conditions and had the states resubmit proposals without those restrictions. And they estimate that they've saved $21 billion as a result. Now, that having been said, the White House is now trying to tie its own AI-related conditions to the grants going forward, so we'll see how that plays out. Now, with regards to, I think, abundance and the law, my sense is that I think we're unlikely to see sort of a revolution of the moderates, right, to revamp the American legal system. That's not how moderates work. But I could envision a coalition of kind of center-right types and abundance-minded left advocates who could achieve meaningful reforms of like the singles and doubles variety. I can see things like focusing on performance-based regulations rather than process-based regulations. adopting sunset clauses to make sure that every few years we check in and make sure that this regulation is still serving its original purpose. Shot clocks for permitting applications. And more generally, a shift from ex-ante precautionary regulations toward liability rules that would encourage actors in the private sector to take risks and while protecting against actual harms that might result from their activity. But I think my colleague and I probably part company in the back half of the book, right? Where Klein and Thompson are encouraging the building of state capacity in order to be an engine for this growth. I agree that state capacity can be a catalyst for growth. They use the way in which the governor of Pennsylvania quickly cut through the red tape to get the I-95 bridge rebuilt in Philadelphia, much more quickly than anyone could have anticipated. But it's important to recognize that this claim about state capacity has to be tempered with public choice concerns that I think the book largely ignores. Regulatory czars, even soft technocracies, right? This can increase the risk of capture by special interest. And in fact, I think the unstated premise in the book is that capture by special interest is a big chunk of how we got to where we are now, whether that be the problems with zoning or the problems that I was talking about with BEAD. And I think, we can talk about this later, Chris, but I think concern about capture of what used to be a fairly politically neutral administrative state is part of what's driving the anti-administrative pushback from the Supreme Court now. My sense is you have to be careful when building state capacity because you may just be creating a bigger monster that can be taken over in the same way. My preferred approach would be, instead of focusing on increasing bureaucratic discretion, we should be seeking to limit it through very clear rules, predictable rules that make it clear, and clarifying property rights, so that private actors know what the rules of the road are, and it reduces uncertainty as they move forward to try to solve the big problems that Klein and Thompson want us to solve.
Great. Bridget?
Yeah. All right, thanks. Really glad to be here to talk about these ideas. I am going to tell you about a project that I'm working on called The Rise of Citizen Voice. I'm in league with economist and public policy professor Leah Brooks, who works at GW, and we're attempting to measure how and whether federal law has encouraged citizen voice over the past century, by which we generally mean public participation requirements before government decision-making. Our interest in this project flows in part from the abundance critique and the procedural fetish critique, this argument that process steps, including mandatory participation in public decision-making, increases the cost of housing, highways, transit, and other big good things that we want to have the good life, right? Puts these things that we all want, clean energy, more, just out of reach. And while I think most people would have the intuition that our current state of affairs involves more, perhaps much more, public participation than in the past, specifics on how this grew and how and whose participation has been increasingly invited by way of statute, we just don't know much. So Dr. Brooks and I hypothesized that Congress sharply increased the extent of citizen voice mechanisms beginning around the 1960s, and that the nature of congressionally directed participation itself has changed over time. We aim to measure the extent and type of these mechanisms, and in this project, we're using quantitative textual analysis of federal statutes from 1925 to 2025, so 100 years of statutes. That will illuminate the statutory mechanisms of citizen voice, including how and whether they've evolved over time. So, you know, the centerpiece of all of this is probably going to be a big line chart that starts at, you know, from your perspective, 1925 and goes to 2025, and it's going to have something that goes, you know, sort of somehow up, right? So you might think, well, why bother if you could just draw it now? Well, we do want the receipts, right? We do want the receipts. Of course, to do this, we have to figure out how, you know, we have to define what we mean by citizen voice and public participation. At this stage, we're casting a wide net on the theory that we'd rather scoop up more and then be able to leave things aside if we decide we don't want to include them in. So for example, we're taking an expansive view of who is being asked to participate, inspired by literature that's considered how individuals, firms, interest groups, advocacy organizations, state or tribal actors, and more interact with federal policymaking processes. And in this project, we view all of these actors, public and private, as potentially participating in the policymaking process. So we're basically building ourselves a little machine that's going to crawl through 100 years of statutes to look for things that we teach it to identify as citizen voice or public participation opportunities. So that could be comment periods, that could be public hearings, that could be specific consultation requirements, meaning this agency has to go talk to that group before they make a decision. Advisory boards and committees, sort of expert bodies that weigh in on decisions, and just any other kinds of forms of expert or other input before an agency can make a choice. We're also looking for post-decisional mechanisms like opportunities to sue to overturn an agency's decision. This is an element of our design that lawyers mostly object to on the grounds that participation, in theory, is something that happens before government actor makes a decision. I'll note that everyone from other fields seems as perfectly reasonable because, after all, if you can influence the outcome of a government decision, then surely that must count as participation. But we don't have to fight about that today because we're talking about how all this rolls back up into some conversation about the abundance agenda. For purposes today, we just have to know that we're aiming for a definition of participation that's broad and flexible enough to apply across a century of statutes and the drafting changes that that time period implies. So with funding from the Arnold Foundation, we're deep in the data gathering phase, but the picture is starting to emerge. For uninteresting data availability reasons, we're starting at both ends. So we're starting in the 20s and then the other 20s, I suppose. So we're sort of working towards the middle. And my chart is already beginning to emerge, right? So in the 20s, you see participation quite low. Basically, they didn't want agencies to be talking to nobody about nothing, right, in those days. Maybe a governor before you construct a dam on their land, but that's just about it, right? Also, the nature of federal programming was very different in the 1920s, so these are related. But by the 2020s, you see a lot more explicit participation requirements. Talk to this group at this time on this topic before a decision gets made, right? A much more granularity and directing the agency, requiring the agency to cast a much wider net before making decisions. So we can already see that even in the modern era, participation doesn't attach everywhere. So for example, defense and military programs almost never have participation requirements as we define them, while social and environmental programs do. I don't think I'd expect otherwise, but like all good empirical projects, findings like these help you see what you've taken for granted and just help you think about how we've drawn lines about where the public is welcomed to the table and where they are not, and what that means about why we're making these choices. Anyhow, measuring things like this is fun, but as Chris would say, so what? Right? So let's assume our data reveals that yes, indeed, participation requirements have been going up. So what? So for some, this stirs an instinct to pare back, and I get it. I'm not necessarily opposed, but to me, that's not really the point of this exercise. Just because we measure it, we don't know whether it's too much, just right, or too little, right? We could say, hey, good start, we need more of this, or we could say, whoa, we've gone completely over our skis here, this is too much. To figure that out, to figure out whether it's worth it, whether we've got the balance right, you have to put this together with some kind of other measure, some sort of indicator, economic growth, I don't know what. That's a problem for another day, and that's probably going to be 10 years from now, realistically, based on how it's coming so far. So we won't know how much we also won't know from our project how much people actually use these participatory mechanisms, even once Congress puts them in place, right? So we won't have usage indicators, just the requirement that the agency do it. But in the meantime, with the abundance agenda in its ascent, a president who's allergic to process and a supine Congress, we are already seeing process steps get skipped, likely in violation of the law. And I understand formal objections to this. I have many of them myself. But what I'd really like to be able to offer is some kind of way of thinking about when we need public participation in government decision making. And for me, this starts with the role that participation plays in government decision making. And here I think I can re-enter the abundance conversation more clearly, because I think you can do something similar with all of the different kinds of process steps that the abundance agenda would have us re-examine and potentially remove. If we do that, it might help us evaluate what to keep and what to pare back. And if we get this wrong, we might make some errors. So for example, on participation, I think it's a mistake to equate participation as being only or even mostly about democratic legitimacy. My view is that participation advocates have fallen into a bit of a trap, because if participation is about legitimacy, then you need to strive for ever more of it, with no sense of how you'll ever know when you've had enough. Can you ever have enough legitimacy? It's really only the great poet MC Hammer who was too legit to quit. The rest of us simply must keep at it. And if you think participation is what gives government action its legitimacy, then you have to wrap your entire body around it and hold on to it for dear life. This is the trap. You find yourself arguing for another comment period, another consultation, consultation later, consultation earlier, because we're ever striving for more consultation. While the action is deferred, and you can't actually articulate when you've had enough participation. My view is that while participation might confer legitimacy benefits, it's a trap to conclude that action without participation is illegitimate, right? So we just get that wrong. So if we don't need participation for legitimacy, what's it for? Well, it can bring diffuse knowledge into government, of course, and I feel like that ground has been well covered, and it's terribly important, and so that makes sense. But also, and here's the part that I'm most interested in now, and particularly in light of our separation of powers moment, participation requirements are the infrastructure for the fire alarm theory of congressional oversight. So alerting the public to potential decisions and changes gives the public a chance to alert their representatives and to encourage congressional oversight. Viewing participation requirements as empowering Congress changes their value proposition, and I think gives us more room to think about how they contribute to our overall system of government and governance. The abundance agenda invites us to take a look at our accumulated processes, these things that have just built up and up over decades of time, and that's good. I think the next phase of the abundance movement is to get more specific about what folks want to cut and be able to explain how to tell the difference between process that's worth it and process that isn't. Thank you.
That's great. And finally, Dan.
I guess I'm next, yeah. So first of all, really happy to be part of this conversation. Thanks for the invitation. I'm going to make 3 points, basically. The first one is, from my perch, I think the basic motivation behind the abundance movement, that we need more stuff, and particularly public good stuff, seems basically right, which seems like a banal observation, but it's worth underscoring. I mean, I think for a long time, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded our infrastructure at D+, which is just, you know,
really bad.
That's not good. Ask my students.
Not good.
Right? I think recently it was upgraded to C, but still not doing so well.
Great.
I haven't studied the issue closely, but it seems like there's some consensus that things like supply shortages of housing are indeed part of why so many people are unhoused in certain places. This story that we need more stuff is very true, rings very true in areas that I study, energy and the energy transition, where we need a lot of electric power transmission in order to meet our growing energy needs, whether we're talking about transmission to bring on more renewable energy or to bring on more data centers for the AI revolution. We're going to need a lot more energy, and that requires a lot more transmission. Some estimates put it at about double the current transmission capacity of our system as it exists now, within the span of like 10, 20 years, right? Which is just a huge project, right? So I think that's definitely true, that we're gonna need a lot more stuff specifically in that area. At the same time, I do think it's worth noting that sometimes we don't want abundance. We have a surplus, so it's not always an unabated good. It's very situationally dependent. So we don't want an abundance of Starbucks, I don't think. We already have a surplus of Starbucks, right? More seriously, going back to the transmission example that I just mentioned, it seems like there it's been quite situational. In the past, we didn't want a ton of transmission being built. There was a lot of concern about the so-called Johnson effect, the over-incentive to build big capital infrastructure if you're a public utility because you're guaranteed a certain return on investment. So you're going to build and build and build, arguably to excess, right? On AI, though, I think there's also a similar risk of overbuilding. If it turns out that projections about AI growth are, exaggerated, if we're building a lot in that area, we might end up saddling ratepayers with a lot of responsibility for infrastructure that will never be used and useful, right? So at the end of the day, my first big point is, yes, abundance sounds great, but it really does depend on the particular area we're talking about, and there's likely to be a lot of disagreement about what those particular areas are where we need abundance as opposed to curtailing a surplus. Okay, so that leads to a second observation, which is the means by which we achieve abundance, assuming we think that it's a normatively attractive idea for a particular policy area, are very likely to also be context dependent. So I see two big claims floating around the abundance movement, one associated with more right of center thinking, libertarian thinking, and the other associated with more left of center thinking, both of which sort of share a dissatisfaction with the way that current government works, as we've heard from other panelists. So for the left, I think the story is that the means for achieving abundance have to do with drastically paring down administrative procedures and opportunities for public participation, what Bridget was just talking about, which often function as veto gates to government action. For the right, it means that we have to rescind existing regulations that stifle competition, so kind of the Tellis and Lindsay captured economy kind of point, that there's a lot of inefficiencies that are created by regulation. So if we just clear the pathway, the private sector will supply these goods, these public goods, in excess. I think, though, that we're very likely to get things wrong if we think that either or both of these conventional solutions will always work, right? So I'm a big fan of SimCity. I used to play SimCity all the time, and you probably, if you've ever played SimCity, you know that you can just kind of move the dials on various things and things magically happen, right? Well, the real world is not like that. These are not dials that we can turn that always lead to concomitant increases in supply of whatever it is that we're trying to build more of. The world is very complicated, and we often misdiagnose real causes when we apply some grand narrative. So going back to transmission, energy transmission, my hobby horse, there might be some role that veto gates and existing regulations are playing in inhibiting the building of transmission infrastructure. But I have studied the issue, and I think an even bigger reason why we haven't seen a massive build-out of interstate power transmission is uncertainty about the future. It turns out you need a lot of coordinated planning and commitment over long time scales to undertake something as big as a doubling of your energy infrastructure grid. And for that, you need both process and regulations. You need a lot of stability and some kind of actor that can do a lot of coordination. It could be that conventional abundance solutions from the left and the right actually would do more harm than good, would take us a step back by eliminating some of that certainty, some of the rules of the game that have long sort of organized the field. It turns out that many infrastructural needs are kind of like this, whether it's highways or transmission lines or whatever it is. They involve extremely complex coordinating and sequencing challenges, again, over long time scales. And for that, I think you need a lot of state capacity, right? Which means that the libertarian version of abundance can't ever really be entirely right. And because it's almost unthinkable that you would have a lot of state capacity without opportunities to contest state power through public participation mechanisms, it's hard to imagine that the left version of abundance that strips public participation severely would be politically viable in any sense. Okay, so the final point I want to end with, and it builds on the others, is that abundance, I think, has the best chance of success as a movement, as a political reframing, if it doesn't put the cart before the horse. Right now, abundance theorists like Klein and Thompson and Mark Dunkelman are very much leading with big and often idiosyncratic theories and grand narratives about what's really driving the lack of abundance. And I think this makes perfect sense, of course, because they're trying to build political coalitions for their movement, right? And you need to tell a convincing story, and sometimes those stories have to be a little simplified, right? But at the end of the day, even though there's a place for that, I think there are better prospects for the abundance movement writ large, kind of in the long term, if it effectively becomes a banner for a style of pragmatic politics that remains agnostic about causes and solutions, and that commits itself to a program of problem-driven study and deliberation. I think part of the problem that abundance theorists correctly identify is the lack of a real forum for these kinds of discussions to happen, and a lack of information to inform deliberations about these decisions. So it's not going to happen in your local zoning board that we're going to have this kind of discussion about abundance is very attentive to questions about what really drives abundance or the like. There's not a lot of capacity at that local level. So I think abundance can kind of supply some of the thinking that then could filter out and inform lots of decisions at lots of different governmental levels. That's an attractive vision for me of what abundance could be, but again, it has to be somewhat not committed to particular ideas or solutions, more about providing information to actors about likely causes, and it involves a lot of study and careful attention to context. The problem, I suppose, is that this sort of takes us back to square one. Abundance is such a shapeshifter, if it's just pragmatic politics, that it effectively means nothing distinctive from our given political divisions. Steve Tellis, in a recent piece, views this as a strength. He says abundance is syncretic, which is a word I had to look up. But he says basically it means that it can attach itself to just about any ideological or cultural milieu. And indeed, he identifies 6 different versions of abundance that run the gamut between socialism, what he calls red plenty, to centrist neoliberalism, moderate abundance synthesis, according to him, and all the way to Trumpist nationalism, what he calls dark abundance, right? But at some point, these different visions actually do matter, right? So take bureaucratic autonomy and government's coordinative capacity, some of the things I was talking about earlier. This is a key part of how we build state capacity to address problems, but this will clash with right-of-center versions of abundance that emphasize eliminating bureaucratic disincentives for the private provision of public goods. So what does abundance do for us at the end of the day if it doesn't transcend existing political divisions? Perhaps it's a pure slogan, not a genuine transcendence of our politics. And that's okay from my perspective. That may just open the door to more discussions down the road, kind of break down some ideological silos and divisions, and get us talking. And that's a great outcome from my perspective. I would say, though, that's a little bit disappointing, right? Because so much of the buzz around abundance is that it is going to be something that sort of transcends our politics, right? That actually genuinely resolves conflict over the good, the vision of the good for society. And that, I think, is expecting a little bit too much of abundance. So overall, I guess I would just end with saying, let's not expect too much from this movement, but let's still be curious in it, about it, as I think we all are here today. So, yeah.
All right, so the way this is going to work is I'm going to start by saying, do you guys have any hot takes with respect to each other? And then I will call on people in an entirely unfair and discretionary way at the microphones or ask my own question.
So I had a really quick reaction, not to steal
Yeah,
the
go.
mic again, but to Chris's suggestion about the proportionality approach and the major questions doctrine. I mean, you know, it works quite well with the vision of pragmatism that I was just sort of articulating, right? But I think a really critical problem is the sorting mechanism. What is a significant enough issue, a major enough issue that we're going to give it the full treatment?
Yes,
versus
what is a
not
major
to,
question?
right? So I'm just curious how you think about that. I mean, that has been a criticism of the major questions doctrine as has been rolled out. Nobody quite knows. Even tariffs, right? There's debate about whether it kind of crosses that threshold, right? So just curious how you see that as being
I
implemented.
mean, I don't think, I've never really found, when it comes to major questions doctrine, I've never really found these critiques to be very persuasive. I mean, so many doctrines in law were deciding what counts as something or not, and you categorize it through a common law method. But my proposal is like beyond just like legal doctrine, right? I think it's more like Congress in a lot of ways can decide what are the major value judgments or not, like by setting certain procedures on different things that are triggered. We have my formal rulemaking for really big things and others. But I do want to underscore, and I think the court is also underscoring, that it's not just about money, right? Like for me, it's a major value judgment that we're looking at, the more important the value judgment. In other words, I think like Gundy, the case about whether the Attorney General can criminalize prior, sex offenders for not notifying school districts about living places, like being able to make criminal laws a major value judgment. I think that should be a very easy place to kind of put that. How individuals are detained after they've been decided they've been removed is a major value judgment. So I don't want to limit it to money. I think that's a mistake. I want to limit it. I want to kind of focus more broadly. And I'm actually kind of fine with the uncertainty of what this means, because I think we as a society have to kind of decide what it means. And hopefully Congress decides some of that. Some of the stuff that Congress decides the courts can have to patrol. But I think we have to start doing it. And I do think it also like deals with the asymmetry problem you've talked about in other work, is like, this isn't just about the big stuff. This is also deciding what's the little stuff. Like where do agencies really have the implementation, technical expertise that we really shouldn't have courts messing with, or Congress for that matter. And so I think I want to kind of make sure this story is not just a one-way ratchet, that it really is kind of going in both directions. And I think the abundance movement would agree with me on that part and disagree with me on the other. And it's a huge problem for me if the abundance movement it doesn't start to agree on major value judgments. Who makes them?
Any other hot takes before we do real questions?
Bridget, I love the, as you probably know, I find the public participation legitimacy stuff to be kind of silly. And in part, like, I just don't think that's why we have it. And I normally framed it more that public participation is more about having effective government. And I guess it's so obvious, and I never really thought about it carefully. I love your point more about accountability as well. Like the idea of like, that it's not just about like more effective government, getting the best ideas out before the regulators to think about them. It's also about raising those ideas to the public so the legislature, the president, the states, the regulated industry can all kind of respond and grapple with that. So I would just kind of flag that as like, I think in your project there are going to be so many things you can't answer, but I do hope in the theory of participation that you really build that out more, because I think that has a lot of legs. I hadn't really thought about it as carefully as I should have before.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate that support, and I've been thinking about how, and I don't know if you would agree with this characterization, but others on the panel might or might not, but this idea that the Supreme Court is choosing to make a stand on certain approaches to what's major, right, is a good example, where you have a court sort of disregarding what I would call sort of standard statutory analysis and just sort of inserting this threshold question, is it major or not? If yes, did Congress explicitly answer it? If no, then you're back to zero. That like almost hyper attentiveness to the text of a statute like disregards everything around it, not just within the statute itself, but also all of these procedures that attend to it. So if you know that an agency's decision, that the authority for which flows from a somewhat vague provision of statute, if the agency's decision is still going to be attended to by a whole host of what I would call sort of good governance mechanisms, whether that's public comment or consultation or whatever, it is not as though the agency can just make a run for it and do whatever it wants, right? It's going to have to stop along the way with these checkpoints with the public and therefore with Congress. And so I think the court, by sort of focusing so much on the narrow statute in front of it, is ignoring the context in which the agencies operate, right? All of these sort of trans-substantive good government statutes. And I think that misses the separation of powers components that those good government statutes, including things that require public participation, impart to that agency or require of that agency. And I think that's meaningful, and I hope to get into that as well, but not with this project.
So I want to plus one that. I thought it was a great point. I have a long gestating paper on the rise of mass comments, where I wrote kind of what I thought about it and then realized that I didn't have anything new to say that you hadn't already said, so I haven't finished the paper.
That's very kind.
So I noticed that, just pulling the comments to the right and the left of me together, I wrote down on my paper, is Nick Bagley the resurrection of James Landis? And I think that's an interesting question. It's a tongue-in-cheek way of raising an interesting question, right? Which is the administrative state was born in this sort of pie-in-the-sky New Deal era where, you know, politics is dirty and bad, and we really need to trust good governance to technocrats, independent, who are as divorced from politics as possible. And I think it was the experience of those New Deal, and this is not my theory, it's Gary Lawson's story, but I happen to think it's right? That as those New Deal era agencies evolved over the 50s and 60s, they kind of fell victim to capture and wound up distorting the initial charters, which is why that second round of agencies you see in the 60s and 70s have much more procedural, much more detailed procedural issues in their organic statutes in order to hold their feet to the fire and limit capture. I think what we're seeing now is the tail end of that epicycle, right? The downside to the proceduralism overcorrection. So is the answer sort of somewhere in the middle, or are we going back to square one? Or are we doomed to relearn all of the lessons that those ahead of us were trying to teach us?
Yeah, can I jump on? So not to get too biographical, but Nick and I arrived at DOJ the same day in HR,
No way.
and that's where we became like really good friends. We've been good friends since. And I only stayed for a year, and I'm more distrustful of government than the average person. But Nick's not. I mean, during Nick's time at the Justice Department, where we worked on the civil appellate staff defending agencies, that's what we did, right? He was there for a long time, and from that experience, he came away with trusting agencies a ton because he interacted with them a lot, and he thought they generally acted in good faith, had expertise and the like. And he came to hate courts because he thought courts didn't know what they were doing and always got in the way of that expertise. And I think that really informs his vision of that. And if you read his work through that lens, you'll actually see it, that he has a ton of trust in what agencies do and a lot of distrust in what courts do when it comes to regulating. And I would say mine's the opposite reaction. And if you kind of read our work together, like, we come from different perspectives. And if the abundance move's about that, I kind of get in where you're at. If it's about building state capacity, I'm really nervous. If it's about tearing down barriers to market entry into markets functioning well, I'm there. But I worry that a lot of it's actually more about building the market, building the state capacity in ways. And I just don't trust the state as much as Nick Bagley does.
Yeah, my experience was exactly opposite of that, sort of similar to the inverse of Nick's along your lines, right? I came out of law school a pretty strong supporter of agencies, and then I think from the Obama pen and phone speech forward, right? I don't have to go to Congress for my goods. I have a pen and I have a phone. I can call my agency heads and have them do through Chevron what Congress is refusing to do, right? From that point forward, I sort of flipped on agencies, and I think with RFK Jr. at FDA, right, we're beginning to see that those on the other side are showing now a similar level of skepticism.
So, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
So I'm glad you brought up trust, Chris. I mean, I think that's a really important part of the discussion, kind of the background and the overlay of a lot of this. I mean, trust in government has been declining for quite a long time. And I think it's going back to something that Bridget sort of brought up, like legitimacy may not directly flow from public participation, but to some degree, there's going to be an effect. And, you know, I think Nick is quite quick in his procedure fetish piece to sort of say, well, it's not a big effect, right? Or if it's there, it's outweighed by people's interest in sort of being efficient in how we accomplish whatever we're trying to accomplish, right? So there are delay costs of procedure that are not worth incurring in order to feed our craving for legitimacy. I think a lot of people are closer, actually, to where Chris is in distrusting government. And in a recent study that I did with Brian Feinstein at Wharton called Valuing Administrative Democracy, we sort of pushed back, I think, a little bit on what Bridget was saying, that public participation doesn't really serve any legitimizing function. We find that people actually do, through experimental surveys, give a lot of credit to government agencies that provide robust opportunities for public participation. It's not a meaningless effect. It's there. You can measure it, right? People do appreciate these opportunities. More to the point they actually appreciate them knowing that they're there, right? They might be able to engage before the agency in deliberation. And importantly, we also look at the trade-off, right? How do people think about balancing that interest in legitimacy versus the delay costs that are incurred because of it? And we find that people are willing to tolerate a large degree of delay and cost in order to fulfill their urge for legitimacy. And I do think one thing that's in the background of a lot of this debate about abundance is the idea that we might be able to strip away a lot of this without any kind of political backlash. I think our study suggests that might not be the case, right? We do need to be concerned with the lack of legitimacy that would flow from a lot of administrative decision-making without adequate process, right? And it's not just about information, it's literally about the sort of psychological effect, kind of in a Tom Tyler type point, procedural justice. People are more willing to accept a decision that even goes against their interests, something that's adverse to them, if they feel like they had a chance to raise their voice, contest whatever's happening.
And I think Nick's response would be like, maybe who cares if the government's not effective, if the bridges aren't being built, if affordable housing is not there. Well, that's where government gets their legitimacy, is when we have no inflation, we have jobs, the economy's doing, so he's like, so sure, there might be some value to participation, but there's so much more value to effective governance, and participation gets in the way of that. That would at least be his response.
All right, are there any audience, people raising their hand. I see Marie in the back. There's a microphone. So folks, sorry, I thought this was somewhat more obvious. There's a microphone there, and I don't think there's another one. So if people want to line up, then I'll be aware of who has a question. So you can just sort of go there. Please.
Thank you. I have a quick question for Daniel Walters. You got me thinking with your discussion about whether there's a substantive commitment that unites sort of abundance people and distinguishes them. You made this interesting claim that you can redescribe a lot of movements in terms of you've got Trumpian dark abundance or socialist abundance, and then you sort of drew from that we should be thinking about abundance as a kind of methodological approach. At least that's what I took you to be saying. And then when you sort of filled in what that would mean, it sounded to me like you came out with technocracy. And leaders of the abundance movements are technocrats, so that sort of made sense. But I'm inclined to push back on the notion that there's no there there. And I'm wondering what you think about the hypothesis that what unites abundance theorists substantively is the opposition to two distinct, important, quite influential trends. One is that abundance theorists are against degrowth, which is a surprisingly potent set of ideas amongst climate theorists. And second, abundance theorists are against dematerialization of politics, specifically, for example, focus on identity politics to the exclusion or our subordination of material concerns. And so it's an insistence on an older materialistic idea about, the political project. So what do you think about that? Can I save it?
Yeah, at that level of generality, yes, I think we can, which is a common story with abundance, right? All depends on the definitions, right? But I think degrowth, it's great if we can set that beside. I don't think that has actually been a very prominent view, even among energy scholars and advocates. Maybe in some corners of the climate debate, it might have been an issue. But to me, it's sort of a marginal part of the discussion. So I don't know that we needed a huge movement like abundance to sort of set that to the side.
I was going to say, you do come from Texas, Jen.
I come from Texas. I think I'm reasonably attuned to the debates around energy transition and climate in the United States. Maybe it's different in the UK. I'm not sure exactly.
Yes, you have. Dan, I have to say, though, I do think in my ideological bubble, that's how we view most Democrats, as degrowth.
No,
That's
so
not-
unfair.
That is
At least
That's ridiculous. I'll fight you about that.
I don't know. I do think that resonates a bit. I am curious your thoughts on the other part, though. What about the second?
Dematerialization? I had not really thought about abundance being something that moves us beyond identity politics, kind of cultural issues. But of course, it does make sense that that's sort of I mean, it's baked in to the kind of focus of the movement just on things like infrastructure, right? To me, that's a healthy development. I mean, there are very serious problems that that I talked about at the beginning of the remarks. D+ infrastructure, not very good, right? So, I mean, to the extent that things are getting that bad on the material side of things, we absolutely need attention to that, and some rebalancing of the political agenda, certainly among elites, I think would be a great thing. So I applaud that aspect of what Klein and Thompson are doing, what Dunkelman is doing. I actually had not thought of them as directly speaking to that issue in the precise way that you sort of brought it up, but it does make sense, right? I mean, there's an urging of elites generally to be more attentive to the needs that people actually have, right? And whether that's energy, housing, roads that don't have tons of potholes in them, any level of generality. Like, I think that's really key to our current political situation. There's a sense in which elites have sort of failed us by not actually responding to the lived experience of average people. And abundance can kind of redirect us to that a bit, and I totally applaud that. Again, I don't know that actually really gets us very far, though, on the kind of concrete questions of where we focus our attention. I think it's probably true, right, that we can't solve all our problems in one fell swoop, right? And this is a very long-term project to get from D+ to A+, right, on infrastructure. If we broaden it beyond infrastructure, even more to do, right? So, there's going to be priority setting that has to happen, agenda setting, right? There's going to have to be some choices that are made about where we really invest our efforts, even if we're totally bought into abundance, which ultimately, means that we're going to have some political disagreements, right? I suspect that I am in the minority in this room on questions of high voltage transmission, right? For instance, right? Because I ultimately think we need to have an energy transition and probably also quite a bit of AI as well. So, but at the end of the day, like, I don't expect everybody to disagree or to agree with me on that. So there are going to be political disagreements on a substantive level about what material goods are worth investing in, and abundance doesn't help us solve any of that, right? So again, levels of generality.
I do want to kind of validate the reality of the movement that Marie is pointing out, though, and not in a kind of snarky Democrats don't like growth way. And maybe this is because I teach at Brooklyn Law School, but there are a number of people, and it's always hard to know like what percentage of people this is versus how loud they are on Twitter versus all of that, right? That are explicitly like, the world was a better place when life was simpler, and we would all be happier and have better well-being if we all had less stuff. And there are people who explicitly believe that, and I think Murray's point is worthwhile, that the abundance movement is an explicit rejection of that as a way of thinking about the way to the good life. Yes, please.
Great. Hi. Thank you for this really interesting panel. I had two questions. One is, it seemed to me that when you were speaking, or at least two of you have in mind the federal government. But of course, a lot of abundance really is about at the state level, especially all the debates about housing. And I'm wondering if any of your analysis or thoughts change when you move from the federal to the state level. So in just a legal, like, major questions, is that still the right frame? Is it still about separation of powers, or is it more about due process? Or how does the analysis change when we shift our focus to state governments? And then second, I think, and this goes maybe a bit to Dan Walter's points, like one of the major fault lines within the abundance, like the Steve Tellis from Red Plenty to Dark Abundance, is the question of whether or not in providing more goods that society needs, we should jettison labor standards or environmental protections, right? Like, at what cost do we provide more? And that seemed to not really kind of emerge in your comments as well. I was just curious to reactions. And maybe a flip side of that is, in terms of procedure, is it upfront participation that is too excessive, or is the concern really kind of the litigation challenges and veto points later on?
Yeah, this is where I think we're suffer from the fact that Jonathan Adler wasn't able to join us, because in our earlier conversations, he was highlighting one of the important intersections of between abundance and federalism, right? Particularly for those of us who are kind of right of center, federalism is one of those sacred cows. We tend to really like it. We like this idea of decentralized government, right? Decisions being made closer to the people, laboratories of experimentation that happen when you allow things at the state level rather than the federal level. And one of the big, I think, implicit claims in abundance is you need regulatory czars and preemption, right, in order to reduce the veto gates that happen at state and local level. And so those are in tension, right? In the regulatory federalism work that I've done in the past, right, we kind of looked at how do you calculate optimal jurisdiction analysis, right? What's the right level of government at which a point should be made? To think about the value of experimentation and trying several different approaches to a particular public policy problem compared to what are the spillover effects of one state acting in a way that has negative externalities for other states. Permitting reform is one of those places where I think the needle is starting to move toward more of a preemption kind of approach, precisely because the spillover effects are outweighing the incremental benefit that we're getting from continuing to preserve localism. And I think those are the kinds of questions that abundance really challenges those of us on the right with, right? So there's a lot of sacred cows, federalism being one of those, that we're really gonna have to think hard about as our own impediments to growth and innovation.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. I hadn't really focused on that side, but on the analogy side, I'm glad you asked that, because no, I don't think it maps onto local government at all. I think that the vision I have is much more about the federal, and I hate it. I really hate when folks try to like analogize from state to from federal to local. It just doesn't work. I mean, at state you might have some analogies. When you're looking at local government, I mean, the regulators are elected. I mean, it's a whole different structure. It's much closer to the people. And I don't think the whole kind of idea the legislature does this, the regulator does this. Oftentimes the regulator is the legislature at the local level with the city council or a zoning board or the like. So I think it doesn't map on the same way. And abundance probably has more traction for me at the local level until you get to the fact that what they're really trying to do is preempt local at the federal level, and then I'm kind of off again. Then you got to have Congress involved making those major value judgments. And preemption for me is a very major value judgment.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about, I'm thinking about public participation requirements and, citing decisions for energy or, single-family home districting, right, zoning decisions, that's all local. And so I think my view of participation is that, of course, a local community should be aware of and have an opportunity to react to plans for development, but does that mean it's a veto functionally? I think we see all over the place the reasons why it goes to excess. So if I don't know if that's a product of local control in and of itself, if that is an argument for moving it to the state level, if it's an argument for just changing the way that public input gets handled in the process, I think it's very tricky, but I do think that's one area where the attentiveness to where seemingly government choices get sort of ground to a halt at the expense of societal good, right? Ground to a halt because of, say, incumbent landowners wanting to protect their property values, right? That can't be the only interest that matters in a decision like this. So I do think that the abundance concept is very transferable to certainly local government. Yeah.
Well, points out I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was saying it points out sort of the optimal jurisdiction analysis issue, right?
Yeah.
That we're learning in real time the problem with land use all being settled at the local level is the voters with the houses are the ones who are shaping the government. Yeah. The people who want to move to the city don't have a vote, and therefore the decision makers aren't listening to them. So it's a negative externality on the rest of society, and that's a suggestion that the decision is being made at too low a level and probably needs to be raised up one.
Or you need some kind of structural way to acknowledge the externality, right? And maybe that is an analytical requirement that overrides that interest or something. I don't know. But switching where the decision happens is one of the levers you can pull, but probably not the only.
Just briefly responding to the part about labor that Kate brought up. I'm not sure this is going to be totally responsive, but I mean, one implication of abundance, if it ends up being a massive movement and leads to lots of building, is we're going to need a lot of labor to do that. I mean, this is, real infrastructure, physical infrastructure. A lot has to go into that, right? And one interesting kind of thought, and this might have been what you were alluding to, I don't know, is whether in order to meet that demand for labor, in order to do all of these big things, we have to rethink things like occupational licensing, right? So certain types of reforms, deregulatory reforms, could pave the way for a really drastic change in labor markets, but ultimately, one that can help us meet the demand that we have for big things that require workers, boots on the ground, right? So I haven't really thought a lot about labor regulations in particular, or labor unions and how it relates to abundance, but I just do think that's underlying a lot of this, right? That labor's gonna have to play a very big role in whatever vision comes out of abundance.
I have to say, and I'll take the movement a lot more seriously when it starts targeting unions as a huge impediment to abundance. Until they do, I kind of don't take it too seriously.
Okay, well, as a Wendellberry reading front porch Republic style conservative, I'm tempted to make a case for degrowth. But I'm going to stick with the question that got me online in the first place, and that goes to another buzzy iconoclastic book from a year or two ago, Common Good Constitutionalism by Adrian Vermeule. Where do you guys see overlaps here? And my quick summary of that book is: unleash the general welfare clause. Judicial activism is good if it's our judges, and bureaucratic discretion, APA style, is also great. So there seems to be some levels of overlap here. Just generally,
I'm tempted to say it's a caricature, but I think those are Adrian's actual words.
but anyway, overlaps here, or just this idea of...
I like that. I've actually never thought about those two books or movements together, but I think there might be a fun book review to write about how if common good means abundance, it might be the same movement.
Yeah, although it's subject to the same critique of Adrian's book, which is, his idiosyncratic view of what's in the common
Right.
good.
Who decides?
Yeah, so we have the same problem. We've gone up a level of generality, and we can agree on the common good, and we can agree on abundance, but again, what does it mean?
But I think it's worth noting that there's a sense in which abundance is tapping the same vein that Make America Great Again was tapping, right? Which is, we used to be really good. We used to be good at building things. How do we get back to doing that again? I think Trump harnessed it as a political force. I think Klein and Thompson are saying, we should lay claim to some of that too.
I'm going to interject a half question, which is this feels a little like the dark abundance, Steve Tellis's dark abundance. And I keep thinking about, I happened to be at the talk Peter Thiel gave at Yale Law School. He had been talking about this a lot, that I think J.D. Vance met him at. And in that talk, his whole speech was like, America can't build anymore. And kind of following on from that in terms of an intellectual history way, you have a lot of the sort of Silicon Valley-esque, MAGA-ish movement going to what we just need is a strong executive who's just going to plow through the procedures, and then the good things will happen, which is somewhat in line with the common good constitutional. These are all adjacent ideas, and this does lead to the kind of worry of how do you ensure, I'm saying this is like a kind of jokey question, that abundance leads to getting the fast train between LA and San Francisco, but not knocking down the East Wing and all that kind of thing.
That's the left's kind of concern about abundance, right? We don't have an environmental law, Dan's close, but not. If my colleague Rachel Rothschild were here, for instance, a big environmental law scholar and advocate, I think she would say, well, I'm okay with abundance as long as it favors clean energy and it doesn't favor pipelines. So they really want to make it. Is it going to choose sides? And so far, I don't think they're willing to choose sides. I don't see the abundance movement choosing a side. It seems to try to be like a value neutral, and I don't think that'll last. I don't think you can build a coalition around a value neutral principle. But so far, they've resisted the idea of picking the winners and losers in deregulating or in building state capacity.
But I think this is part of why you ultimately have to reserve a place for public participation as a check on discretion, right? The track record is not good when we just turn it all over to a single person's discretion. The power broker is a classic for a reason, right? What Robert Moses did in New York is, legendary in a bad way, right? And everybody agrees about that, right? Even Nick Bagley, in a lot of his writing, has talked about not wanting to repeat the mistakes of Robert Moses without getting all that specific about how we don't do that, right? But I think public participation has to play a little bit of a role in that, because this is a very real political risk that will go this direction. I mean, you probably saw Mark Dunkelman recently had an op-ed, I think in the New York Times, where he basically said, what we need now is a Trump of the left, right? Blow through all of the constitutional and statutory guardrails and just get things done. Enact your climate wish list through executive order, right? So I mean, the door is open, right? And you don't. I mean, I think we can all see that we can't engage in this kind of, if my side is winning, that's fine. But if the other side isn't winning or is winning, I don't want it, right? I think that's pretty close to the definition of fascism and authoritarianism. So
yeah, I think another aspect that is the civil rights left as well. That it's a hard coalition to build with. When we think of so much of the procedures in the 60s, 70s that were coming up, were also related to Jim Crow and to creating an opportunity to have. We'd rather have some false positives and false, And so let's try to kind of, what error are we trying to eliminate? And I think it's tone deaf to that. It's not just anti-woke, the abundance movement, but it really is not even trying to respond to the risks of, when we remove procedures, how's that going to affect rights? And it'll be interesting to see if they try to calibrate that.
I think that at least for some areas, they think they don't have to make the decision. Because what I'm thinking about when they talk about energy, they think if you have so much clean energy, so much solar power, you're not going to need dirty energy. And so you don't have to have the argument, because there's just going to be so much of what they can, the good, you don't have to fight over it. Greg Schill.
How you doing? I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much. I can't help but wonder if the criticisms that have been made so far could be categorized as, sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory?
Yeah.
I think the criticisms that I've heard today, most
totally.
of them are extremely fair, right? Abundance is maybe an empty vessel, but it has a flag flying from it, and that flag is a purpose. And so I think in that purpose you can see a familial relationship between what Kathy Hochul did, for example, recently in New York, which is to veto a bill that would have required two-man crews on subways, which could easily have been justified by reference to labor rights or safety or so on. And of course the local, the Transit Workers Union, to Chris's point, did advocate very strongly for that legislation, but they lost. You can see a relationship between that outcome on the one hand and states like Montana signing into law preemptive legislation to make it easier to build housing, dense housing, right? Which is not something we typically associate with Western states governed by Republicans. And so there is a slippery slope. One could have a sort of absurdum sort of version of this. But in practice, there seems to be a kind of loose hanging together of goals around the physical environment where there's not enough building, due in part to regulation, in part to interest group pressures, in part to this, that, and the other. And I think there absolutely are embedded conflicts down the road, whether it be around environment or labor or immigration and so on. But the idea is to have a common purpose that's sufficiently widely shared that we can win arguments in different political contexts flying that flag. So I just tee that up maybe as an observation, but also as a question of whether that's a useful lens.
You should be on the panel instead of me. That was very good.
That was very good. I mean, I am a proceduralist to the core, so it's hard for me. I mean, of course, the thing I want to do is make a chart. And I want to analyze it this way, and I want to flip it around and put it this way, and then I want to send it out to a bunch of people and see what they think. You know what I mean? So it is hard for me to get into the mindset of someone that wants to move fast and break things, because I'm the one that chased the policymakers down the hall going, wait. That's how I came up. I was a civil servant for a long time, and I value order and regularity. But you're right. I mean, we are living through a time that I find disquieting on a lot of levels, but part of that is seeing the ability to execute and thinking, can we have nice things? You know, can we build? And honestly, part of that was moving from Arlington, Virginia to Ohio and seeing the extent of the building in Ohio and looking around and seeing what they've been able to achieve. And it's remarkable. I mean, it does improve lives. And so it's causing me to think about that, even though it's so far in my career, my role has been to, you know, study and refine and advocate for, you know, proceduralism. But there has to be a limit, right? And I think that's this larger movement, right? I take abundance as an invitation to say, but not always, right? But not, it's not, the answer isn't always just more procedure, right? So that's how I take it. And on that level, I think it succeeds even at a level of generality. I don't think that's where their ambition ends, though, right? But I do think it's a good sort of shake for those like me who tend to think that the best way forward is analysis, is reasoned decision making, is careful, deliberative thought, right? Because there's a trade-off.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, was it Cass Sunstein who had the concept of an incompletely theorized agreement, right? I mean, there's something to that here, right? Like, the flag is an incompletely theorized agreement. Like, we don't have to define with precision exactly what abundance is or how it cashes out in particular policy areas, as long as we can kind of agree that we're problem-solving people, right? We see problems in the world. We're going to respond to those in some way that's pragmatic, going back to what I started with, right? That might involve stripping away regulations in some instances. It might involve actually increasing things like public participation in others, right? To the extent that it leads to better decisions, right, by decision makers in government. If you come at it sort of from more of a flexible perspective that you're just solving problems, of course we can all agree with it, and that is going to be pretty helpful, I think, in our very fractured political environment, right? I mean, we arguably do need something like that, something like the New Deal was for an entire generation. It eventually broke down, right, because there were underlying disagreements in society that didn't map on to the New Deal's, like, most robust, the James Landis version of the New Deal, right? But at the end of the day, like, it worked for a little while, and a lot of things happened because of it. Some people may think that it's not the best, right? But overall, you know, a pretty good moment in American history, I would argue, anyway. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think the value, you'd said planting a flag, and I think that's right. One of the biggest contributions that this movement is making, right, is setting a star for us to guide ourselves by. Guys, we need to stop fighting over how are we going to divide up the scraps of the former American empire or what was a once great country. Growth and innovation are the way for us forward, and that should be the thing that guides our decision. It doesn't mean like we walk straight through every marsh and wood and rough spot between here and there, but that's the direction we should generally be going. I think that's very valuable.
Please.
Thanks for your presentation. I have two questions. First, the part of your discussion was about agency. I don't know if you have any observation about agency problem versus principle, because all the agency, they have inefficiency because they are not themselves principles. So in economics, it is called inefficiency, and then some people, they calculate. So have you ever think about the observation when you have a huge government and when you have a lot of agency, they create unnecessary inefficiency compared to other like smaller agencies? That's my first question. And my second question is about participation, which was a part of your discussion. When more people participate, for example, about the decision-making process, it doesn't really connects to like a transparent decision because they're all humans. So your observation is like, do you really urge just more participation, or do you have like a critical view about not necessarily higher participation correlates to better decision? That's two questions. Thank you.
So I'll jump in on the participation thing, and this builds a little bit on the paper that I mentioned that I just did with Brian Feinstein. I think it's an optimization problem. Again, things like notice and comment rulemaking, regulatory negotiation, public participation in general arguably serve many purposes. I think part of it is legitimizing the decision that is made in the eyes of the participants or in society in general, what we would call sociological legitimacy. I think part of it's information provision to the decision maker. There's a lot of things that are done positively by public participation, like they're goods that come out of that process. They do have to be balanced, as Nick Bagley says in his procedure fetish piece. They have to be balanced against certain costs, and those include things like delays and the like, right? And it's an optimization problem. And any optimization problem, from my perspective, needs to be quite attentive to real evidence, right? What are the actual benefits and costs of whatever procedure we're talking about? And we actually lack a lot of information about that, right? I mean, people have a lot of opinions about public participation. It does this, X, Y, and Z, and they're all great things. They're gonna democratize society, et cetera. I've written some of that stuff. And then you've got people like Nick who are saying, well, it's just all dead weight loss. Like, this is literally, like, not ever valuable, or maybe rarely valuable. But we need evidence of that question, and then once we have that evidence, I think, and it's gonna always be somewhat granular and context dependent, but if we have the evidence of what the costs and benefits are, and we have rough estimates of what those costs and benefits are, then we can just optimize, right? And that, to me, is the most normatively attractive solution to this very question. We want public procedure when the benefits outweigh the costs.
Is it worth distinguishing between participation and, I mean, I think it is, participation and vetoing, right? Because on the one hand, notice and comment like drags things on, and you have to answer, and da-da-da-da-da, but there's not the multiple points of vetoing that there are in, say, certain zoning hearings at the super local level where, like, a group of people have the ability to, like, stop things and different groups at various points, and, like, that's really one of the main criticisms.
That it's just a veto.
Yeah, that some things are vetoes, and some kinds of participation are just like, and that's going to take another 18 months, which is maybe over a long period of time a veto because it raises the costs of doing things, but it's not quite the same as there's some particular things where there's too many parties who can say no and very few who can say yes.
I think if you talk to a lot of the interest groups that advocate in the space, right, they would say the delay is of ultimate veto because we just need to hold off on the rulemaking until the White House changes hands, and that'll happen in 4 or 8 years.
Yeah.
So as long as we can stall it, it effectively becomes a veto.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, Alex Jett.
Hi, thanks for this very interesting panel, and I think especially for somebody who probably is coming from slightly different priors than most people in this room, as somebody that you probably would regard as like a lefty civil rights scholar. I thought what I found really interesting is that in like left versus liberal circles, the debate has kind of been about like a radical leftist abundance versus like a sort of liberal centrist abundance, right? So there's the Ezra Klein abundance model that we've all been talking about. And Dan, I appreciate you gave that 6, I looked up the 6 kinds, right? And it's interesting because it's all cataloged along this axis about economic materiality. But actually the conversation in like radical left circles about abundance has really been about psychological abundance. Like it comes also, there's this kind of abundance versus scarcity in social psychology idea. And the idea that a lot of the malaises of the contemporary left come out of psychological scarcity that comes out of people's like lived conditions, but results in them not being able to see things as we're just trying to fight over the scraps at the bottom of this pie. How do we get out of this mindset, and how does that impact, modern identity politics, right? And so I think there's something kind of interesting here about this idea of, is there a way, sure, maybe you could say, oh, there's social abundance, and then there's Afrofuturist abundance, and then there's liberal abundance, like there's dark abundance, and maybe it doesn't mean anything. But maybe on the flip side, I would ask, like, would there be a way that we could think about, could we apply these kinds of concepts to civil rights and non-material legal regulation, right? Like, is there something about process taking into account the psychology of scarcity when it comes to regulating civil rights issues? So I'm just kind of curious, from like the outlaw side that is really more focused on things like, administering federal civil rights statutes. Is there something here? And then this sort of second related thing that's interesting, I think, is that the other really big tension between the radical left abundance ideas and then the liberal abundance ideas is really a temporality thing, right? So a lot of like radical left abundance is about the idea that part of the problem is that everyone is in such a rush because we think that it's a crisis to get civil rights, and therefore we move fast and break things, but perhaps move too quickly, become overbearing, cause people to have a backlash against it, and like if we slowed down, we could do it in a more durable way. But I think that the liberal version of abundance is kind of like we have to cut the red tape and move fast, right? So I'm kind of curious about, do you think that it's like, it has to be the case that to make progress that moves forward, we have to move quickly? Like, I think there seems to be this assumption that that's true in Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's work. I just maybe wonder if it is. And I don't know that I'm like, we should be degrowthing, exactly. But also, are we just kind of in too much of a rush sometimes? And I think there's a very different temporal kind of like element going on between those two schools of abundance. So just curious about thoughts on those things.
I'd like to, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, on the second point, I mean, it's very thought-provoking, the idea that, you know, time scales matter here to some degree, and there might be a debate embedded in all this about that as well, and maybe some of the different versions of abundance kind of map onto that. I think that's probably true descriptively, and you know, I think one thing we have to be really honest about is that a lot of the visions of abundance are envisioning quite unprecedented things, right? And again, I'm going to focus on my narrow little world of energy law and, you know, the idea of an energy transition and the build out of high voltage transmission lines and the like. Again, this is something we're being asked to do. We're being asked to double our transmission capacity in the span of a couple decades, right? That's not going to be easy, right? It's going to take some time and a lot of investment. It probably won't get started tomorrow, even if we all magically agreed about that, right? So I do think that like timescales matter here, and if abundance is going to be politically viable, it needs to be realistic about the challenge of like long-term investment and finding ways to deal with the uncertainty problem that I brought up in my initial remarks, right? The fact that we do have changes in current administration, drastic switches in policy and the like that undermine certainty. And how do you find ways to, you know, build a pathway for really big shifts, really big investments? It's got to involve a lot more certainty, and it honestly being, you know, kind of honest about the situation. It's going to require some patience, right? It will not happen tomorrow, right? So I think in the material side of things, like that's definitely a conversation that needs to be had, and probably the people who are on the side of being patient and the like have the better of the argument, given the scale of the ambitions. Yeah.
I mean, to me, the 4-year term of a president, it just looms large over all of this, because there's this idea that, I mean, even I'm most acquainted with like the regulatory timelines, for example, and a president coming in the door is only going to get so much done even in 4 years. And I mean, I would say it's kind of received wisdom that you really need a 2-term presidency in order to get a lot of your regulatory objectives achieved. That's ridiculous. I mean, we don't expect presidents to be able to govern, right? We tie their hands in a lot of ways. But I'm not a unitary executive theorist by any means, right? But if the idea is every 4 years you get a chance to vote on who the president's going to be, that should be in response to, especially after a first-term president, you know, evidence about what it is that they achieved. And it could be that this is all just a pathology of our insistence that the president is the head of our government, right? That this, as though we've like put Congress way on the sidelines, and now all that matters is what the president delivers for us. But to me, that is part of like the franticness behind some of this, is like, well, they've only got 4 years, you know. Klein's written about this sort of breakdown in responsiveness between voters and what administrations achieve in legislation, right, in part because of how long it takes for that legislation to bear fruit. I mean, just think about all the infrastructure investment from the Biden administration that never got done, right, even within Biden's term. So there's this underlying frustration with sort of letting presidents govern, especially when they're trying to deliver social goods to people and getting them hamstrung, you know, by all these procedural requirements.
Anthony?
So I appreciate the point of abundance sort of as empty vessel with a flag, because it seems to imply a particular vision of what the good life is, on which you can't always have agreement, you know, at a broad level. At the same time, I wonder if there really still are structural limits, sort of conceptually, to what people mean by abundance, because it seems to relate, at least what people describe or associate with it, seems to involve sort of creating or innovating or building or developing. And at least to me, that seems to exclude something like compulsory acquisition, which maybe that should be obvious, and maybe that point is simplistic, but it does, by carving out the negatives, start to help shape the concept. And obviously I'm kind of intentionally exaggerating here, but you can get more stuff right by acquiring it, right? A carrier strike group can cut through a lot of red tape, and now Venezuela is part of the energy abundance plan, right? So, is there really structurally something more to abundance that's not, totally empty as a concept?
I think Greg gave a very nice, optimistic, entirely not what they're saying view of abundance. It honestly reads like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce mission statement, and they also have an action plan, which is different than the abundance movement. And the book is much more detailed than that. It's very into the weeds of how to build, how to develop, how to. And so, I think if all we're talking about is a bumper sticker, I'm all for the bumper sticker. I'd love to live an more abundant life. But there has to be a way to get there, and there's an organizing principle here of how to get there, and yet they don't flesh out the details enough for me to feel even remotely comfortable with getting on the abundance train, to mix a lot of metaphors.
I do think that it's a fundamentally liberal, in the very broadest sense of that word, idea, in the sense that there's the right way to get abundance, and probably just taking it and being like, woohoo, is not within the umbrella of liberalism. In that, in the classical liberal plus left liberal, the whole big movement sense. Yes, please. On.
Hi, I had a question about the implications for the parties and the political dynamics of this, because it seems one of the clearest divisions between the parties these days is educational level. So the Republican Party is becoming the party of the blue-collar worker, and the Democratic Party is the college-educated worker who's kind of nervous about various things. And I think, if you think about the abundance agenda, it means we've got to build more stuff. And that fundamentally is going to be built by people who are building stuff, who are out there and have maybe not a college degree, but they know how to build stuff. Whereas the people who are in the bureaucracies, who are, think they're doing something great for society, they're like planning and planning and planning, and maybe some more planning, and holding some hearings, they're the college degree people. And they think they're contributing a lot to society. So I think the Ezra Klein thesis seems a little bit at war with the sort of current base of the Democratic Party, because you have to have fewer of those people, or there has to be less money spent on them and more money spent on the blue-collar workers. It seems, if you actually want to build something, I'm a lawyer. I've never built anything in my adult life, I remember when I was younger, I built something, but
you should try.
But it was very
it's
young.
fun.
What?
You should try. It's fun.
I know. I've done some house repairs, and I've been very gratified by that. And sometimes it hasn't worked out so well, but there's been issues. But still, I think that that's not my major job. And I think many people have degrees in public policy degrees. My university has this huge school that's relatively new that mints public policy people. And those people, in the abundance agenda, I think they've got to be opposed to it. Even if they might sign on to it in theory, they kind of have to if they're going to resist it. And so I would think that there's a political economy here that's sort of built in to resist it, no matter what the theory is. So I'm wondering if I'm right in thinking that, or am I totally wrong in thinking that?
I do think you're right that Klein and Thompson have to be read in their book as, making a pitch to the Democratic Party and engaging in kind of coalition building in a partisan sense, right? And I think their kind of, their assumption is that this loss of the working class, blue-collar workers from the Democratic Party over time, which has definitely happened, is not like that fight's not over. They can be won back by this. Yeah. But you're right to point out that eventually that might start to break the coalition the Democratic Party has built around white-collar workers, right, and elites and the like, right? And so At the end of the day, like, I wonder, though, if Klein and Thompson are right that these things move pretty slowly, right? We're not so far removed from the time when the working class was very much aligned with the Democratic Party that it's inconceivable that they would kind of rush back once this was part of the Democratic Party's agenda. And likewise, because things move very slowly, we're not at real risk in the short term of losing the Democratic base of today, which is more organized around white-collar workers. So, but I mean, at the end of the day, and this gets back to a larger theme of the discussion, you know, they are very much viewing this through a partisan lens. There are parts of the Abundance book that speak as if this is an attempt to create a kind of cross-ideological, transcendence of our current politics. But really, this is a book for the Democratic Party, right? And it may or may not be the case that they're right about how this coalition could be shifted in a way that makes sense for the Democratic Party today. I'm somewhat skeptical that it can be done. I mean, a lot of this really involves complex messaging to the right constituencies, and it's not clear to me that it will actually work, that people are going to be attentive to this kind of messaging about building things. I mean, at the end of the day, certain types of infrastructure that we need a lot of, high voltage transmission lines, are not a political selling point. You don't go to your electorate and talk about these types of things, right? So I'm not quite sure that the abundance focus on certain infrastructural goods is ever going to translate into electoral politics that actually matter.
I tend to agree. I think there's points at which Klein in particular, I say Klein because he did this part of the audiobook, where Klein in particular is speaking to the Democratic Party and saying, you guys need to get on board with a broader coalition and win back some of the blue-collar folks that Trump is winning. And I think this is where they attempt to try to keep the other half, is where the book kind of talks out of both sides of its mouth. Because I think the goal of building stuff, right, a lot of the strength of the book comes from the notion that we need to eliminate regulatory barriers that are allowing that to happen. But then the back half of the book is all about building state capacity, which would appeal to the white-collar members of the existing coalition. And that's where it doesn't quite, I think that's your critique, right? This is where the two parts don't quite hang together.
John, your question reminds me that a fellow law professor of ours has said to me at one point, there was only one lawyer in Galt's Gulch, and I think about that a lot. We have a little less than 10 minutes, so I'm going to ask one slightly fun question, and then ask if you guys have kind of concluding remarks. So the ideating question is, what is one law or regulation or thing that prevents stuff from getting done that you would love to get rid of? And what is one you're like, no, that one's worth it, I would keep it?
Maybe start with Dan. I got to think about this.
Sure, yeah.
I asked this.
I'm ready to go. I'll be somewhat controversial and say a WIRA review could go. Right, and I'm not saying ditch cost-benefit analysis, regulatory impact analysis. That can be done. It is being done by agencies. They should be encouraged to do it, maybe even by statute, right? But at the end of the day, OIRA is a veto point in the regulatory process, and it's one that's incredibly slow and incredibly inefficient. We know that from the past few OIRA administrations, right? I know this is really offending you, Bridget.
I'm just breathing through it.
But I do think that that's the kind of thing that actually, like, the abundance messaging kind of works, right? You're trying to avoid those bottlenecks, right? And OIRA, in some sense, it has been a bottleneck over several administrations. And you can get a lot of the value of cost-benefit analysis, regulatory impact analysis, by just having agencies do what they do without that kind of institutional review. That's what I would get rid of. I think we absolutely, as I've said before, need to keep a general commitment to public participation on some level. But that said, I do think there are like a lot of things that we could change on that front, right? Where we could experiment with public participation in a way where we get, we have less of it, but it's of a higher quality. It actually pays off in a lot of ways. So conventional notice and comment rulemaking, we know, is not terribly effective. It often turns into kabuki theater and the like. We all know that, right? But but there are more kind of deliberative forms of engagement that might actually obviate the need to keep doing public engagement over time. Likewise, doing early engagement with the public before you start a project that requires a lot of permitting can pay off big time in terms of saving conflict down the road. So there are like little things like that that we can definitely do that can make public participation better. So I would keep that, improve it. Yeah.
All right. I would obviously keep OIRA review. If you know me, you know why I'm saying that. If not, you can buy me a drink later and I'll tell you all about it. I would get rid of, I'm writing right now about the Paperwork Reduction Act, which I might be the world's, maybe I'm probably one of 5 people who's a PRA enthusiast. I love it, big fan. Big fan of the Paperwork Reduction Act, but there's a few things I'd change about it, one of which is that it has a second public comment period. This applies whenever agencies, before agencies can collect information from 10 or more people, they have to go through two comment periods actually with the public and get OMB's approval, the office where I used to work. And this is a lot. This is too much. This is too much. That second comment period should go. The thing I would keep is notice and comment rulemaking, and I say that out loud because there are some folks who might think that like consultation with a mini public or consultation in advance negotiated rulemaking or something means that like all interests have been taken care of and we don't need to do this whole time-consuming, public notice and comment business. But I think it's absolute bedrock in administrative law. I think it's one of the best things about our American administrative law system, and I'll lay down in the street before I let that one go. So that's a keeper.
All right, so so my service course is property, so I'll let that speak for a moment. The number one thing I would try to target if I could would probably be zoning law. I think there are a few problems in society that are more broad in society than the housing affordability crisis, and I think eliminating most of our zoning restrictions would allow relatively quick construction of more housing, and that's a statement against interest because I'm a homeowner, but I think it would be what's best for us in the long run. What would I keep despite the fact that it might contrast with abundance? I think so. Generally, I think it's a good idea to focus on sort of ex post liability rules rather than ex ante regulation, right? Don't regulate because you're worried about the risk of harm. Let people act and then let them go to court if and when harm happens. I think where that breaks down is areas where litigation can't fix the harm, and probably the number one example of that is the Endangered Species Act, right? You can't go back and save the animals you've destroyed. So I think it makes sense, despite the fact that it sort of infringes on growth and innovation, to have some forms of that kind of review.
Interesting. You make me think of the snail darter case and how often the Endangered Species Act has been used to.
Yeah, the trick is how to use it without misusing. That's all of the problems, right?
Yeah, I think getting rid of regulatory overreach is kind of, I could go through a bunch of different examples of rules that go beyond what's required in truths of markets. I think to keep, though, I would keep a professionalized civil service. One that slows things down and makes political actors have to engage in reasoning, and I don't know, and I would be willing to make it hard to fire civil servants. I know part of the abundance movement is make it easier to get rid of all the unproductive ones, and I just really worry that that the errors there. I'm much more worried about. I'm not as worried about a lazy civil servant that doesn't do anything than I am of not getting really high quality. As much neutral competence as we can in the civil service, and I think you lose out on that if they don't feel like they have job security on the back end. But I'm also a tenure law professor, so maybe I'm a little biased when it comes to the protections that we get in order to enter the profession.
All right, so with 2 minutes left, does anyone have 30 seconds of sum up, conclusory remarks?
I would just say, as much as I've been negative, I'm really glad that the abundance movement is part of our conversation, and I think we should take it seriously. I think we should push the abundance movement to identify what they're trying to do, but we should also recognize and applaud what they're doing when it's consistent with our views of ordered liberty, of free markets, and the like.
I feel like I read the book as making 2 basic 10,000-foot level proclamations, right? 1, we need to get government to stop doing bad things. And 2, we need to build our government so it can do good things. If we do those things in that order, I'm on board, because I think once it's clear the ways in which government is an inhibitor to growth and innovation, we may find that we need much less actual state capacity than Klein and Thompson suggest. If we go the other way around, let's build up government first, I think that's probably a problem.
I think abundance and its intellectual precursors, of which there are many. This is not an idea that's unique to Klein and Thompson, right? Has a pedigree that goes back. But I think it is an important intervention that disrupts the kind of thinking that just thinks one more review, one more analysis, one more engagement, that'll do the trick, right? Then we'll find nirvana and make a good choice, and we're good to go. There's trade-offs to that kind of thinking, and I think this book and others hold us to account to make sure that when we make those choices to add procedural mechanisms, we do so with a wide view of the consequences.
Yeah, I'll close by just saying I'm really glad we're having this conversation. I think it's super productive and sometimes uncomfortable, and like sometimes we're speaking different languages, but like to me that's very productive. And we need a lot more of that. I do think abundance is very valuable in that sense of just kind of breaking down some silos and giving an opportunity, a place where these kinds of discussions can happen. I think the thing that I kind of take away from this is actually a response somewhat to Alex's point about the time scale of this. I mean, I think these are really big changes we're talking about. Big changes to our politics, big changes to our infrastructure, et cetera, and we do need some time, I think, to really sort through all of this. So it's unfair to expect all of the answers to be here right now. I think getting this project started, keeping these conversations going, could lead to really good things, and we should just be patient and expect it to take some time. So, yeah.
Please join me in thanking our panel.
We gotta make it happen. You'll love it.